The savage warrior meets the human. The battlefield was silent. The air was thick with dust and the smell of burned metal. Broken weapons and shattered armor lay scattered across the ground. In the center of the destruction stood Syra the Untamed, a 10-foot-tall alien warrior, her powerful muscles covered in scars. Her piercing yellow eyes scanned the fallen soldiers around her. They had challenged her, and she had crushed them. She let out a victorious roar, her deep voice echoing across the field. The XRK people believed in strength above all, and Syra was the strongest. She was a warrior, a conqueror, a force of destruction. But today it was different. A human stepped forward. Syra narrowed her eyes as she looked down at him. He was small, too small. He barely reached her waist. His face was calm, his posture relaxed. He wore a simple military uniform, with no armor, no weapons, no fear. The other warriors whispered among themselves. Why was a human here? Syra scoffed. Is this a joke? Her voice was deep, powerful, and filled with amusement. The human did not answer right away. He simply looked up at her with steady blue eyes. Then he spoke. I am Captain Elias Carter. I am here to teach you control. Syra laughed, a loud, mocking laugh. A tiny human. Teach me. You think you can train Syra the Untamed? Carter didn't flinch. Strength without control is weakness. His voice was even, confident. Syra's amusement faded. No one had ever spoken to her like that before. Her people respected her power. They feared her. But this human, he didn't even look impressed. Her lips curled into a snarl. Let's see if you survive my strength, little man. She moved fast, too fast for something her size. Her massive fist swung toward Carter, powerful enough to crush his skull in one hit. But he was already gone. Carter dodged with effortless speed, stepping to the side just in time. Syra's fist slammed into the ground, shaking the battlefield, cracking the stone beneath. She growled in frustration. This human was not running away. He was studying her, watching her movements, learning her. She attacked again. Faster, harder. But Carter was always just out of reach. Syra's rage grew. She was the strongest warrior of the Karkai. She had fought and won against monsters, machines, and armies. How could one tiny human make her feel slow and reckless? Carter finally spoke again. You're not fighting. You're swinging wildly, like an angry beast. Syra's eyes burned with fury. I am no beast. She lunged at him. But at the last second, Carter moved behind her, tapping her back lightly. Then prove it, he said. She froze. It wasn't an insult. It was a challenge. For the first time in her life, Syra felt uncertain. She turned slowly, breathing heavily. Her fists were clenched. No one had ever dodged her attacks this easily. Carter met her gaze. He wasn't mocking her. He wasn't afraid. He was testing her. Strength is nothing without control, he said again. Syra's heart pounded in her chest. Was he right? The Exarchai warriors stood in shocked silence. They had expected Carter to be destroyed in seconds, but instead he was still standing, untouched, unafraid. Syra took a slow breath. She had two choices, crush him or learn from him. For the first time, she wasn't sure which one she wanted more. The training begins. Syra sat on the cold metal floor of the training chamber, her arms crossed, her sharp yellow eyes locked onto Carter with pure frustration. She was not used to waiting. She was not used to being ordered around. And she definitely was not used to losing. But here she was, a 10-foot-tall warrior, being forced to listen to a tiny human who had somehow dodged every attack she had thrown at him. Carter stood in front of her, calm as ever. He wasn't afraid. That alone annoyed her. Fear was natural. Fear was respect. And yet, this human did not fear her. All right, Carter said, arms behind his back. First lesson. Stand up. Syra scowled. I am not a child, human. "Then stop acting like one," he replied smoothly. A low growl rumbled in her throat. She could snap his bones like twigs, but she had been ordered to train under him by the Galactic Council. The HFY warriors watched from the shadows, judging her every move. If she refused, it would bring shame, and Syra did not accept shame. So she stood. "Good," Carter said. "Now, attack me." Syra didn't hesitate. She lunged forward, her massive fist flying straight for his chest. If he thought she was going to hold back, he was wrong. But Carter was already moving. He twisted to the side, dodging effortlessly, his feet light against the floor. Syra felt nothing. No impact, no resistance. It was like punching air. She snarled and swung again, faster this time. Carter ducked under her arm, stepping behind her before she could react. "You're predictable," he said. Her blood boiled. Predictable. No one had ever called her that before. She was the strongest warrior of the HFY. She spun and attacked again, a brutal backhand strike, powerful enough to break through steel walls. But Carter stepped back at the last second, her fist missing his face by an inch. "You rely too much on brute force," he said. "You throw everything into one attack, hoping it lands. But the moment you miss, you're vulnerable." Syra hated that his words made sense. She clenched her fists, grinding her teeth. "My strength is unmatched." "And yet, you haven't touched me once," Carter said, his tone completely neutral. Syra breathed heavily, her powerful chest rising and falling. She was used to winning. She was used to crushing her enemies within seconds. But this human, this tiny, fragile creature, was teaching her a lesson she did not want to learn. Still, her instincts screamed at her. This was important. "Again," Carter said. Syra charged again, but this time, she didn't attack immediately. She studied him, watching for movement. Carter smirked. "Better." But the moment she moved to strike, he sidestepped, pressing 2 fingers against her exposed ribs before stepping away. Syra froze. If Carter had been holding a blade, he could have killed her. She felt the blood drain from her face. For the first time in her life, she understood. Her strength alone was not enough. "Lesson 1, Carter said. "Control your power, or it will be used against you." Syra clenched her fists, her breath sharp. This was more than just training. This was a fight against everything she had ever believed. But she was Syra the Untamed, and she did not accept defeat. So she nodded once. "Teach me." A hard lesson. The training chamber was quiet except for the rhythmic sound of heavy breathing. Syra stood in the center, her massive body covered in sweat, her fists clenched, her muscles aching from hours of combat drills. Across from her, Captain Elias Carter stood completely calm, untouched, unshaken. Syra hated this feeling. For the past 3 days, she had attacked him over and over again, yet she had never landed a single hit. She had crushed warriors, machines, and entire armies, but this small human continued to outmaneuver her. It made no sense. "Again," Carter said, his voice steady. Syra bared her teeth, her rage boiling to the surface. But this time, she did not charge blindly. She remembered his words. Strength without control is weakness. She took a deep breath and studied him. Carter stood with a relaxed posture, but she had learned that his stance was deceptive. His movements were precise, always shifting just enough to stay out of her reach. She feinted left, then pivoted right. A trick maneuver. Carter narrowed his eyes, reacting immediately. For the first time, she saw hesitation. Syra struck low, sweeping her leg toward his feet. It was a calculated move, not brute force. Her foot connected. Carter stumbled back, his balance momentarily broken. Syra's heart pounded with triumph. She had finally forced him off balance. But before she could celebrate, he recovered instantly. The next moment, he was behind her. Before she could react, he placed a single palm against her lower back, a light, controlled push. Zaira staggered forward, her own momentum working against her. She caught herself before she could fall, but the damage was done. Carter had used her own strength against her, again. Zaira roared in frustration and slammed her fist into the ground, cracking the steel floor beneath her. "You're still relying on brute force," Carter said. "You have the potential to be more than a war machine, but you refuse to learn." Zaira's chest rose and fell with deep, furious breaths. "I am a warrior," she snapped. "Fighting is my purpose." "No," Carter said. "Fighting is all you know. There's a difference." His words struck her harder than any blow ever had. For the first time, she had no response. She had been raised in a warrior society. Since birth, she had been trained to be the strongest, the fiercest, the most brutal. She had never questioned it. Until now. Carter stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "You think you're unbeatable, but right now, any trained assassin could take you down in seconds. You're too predictable, too wild." Zaira growled, her hands shaking. Was he right? Before she could answer, Carter turned toward the group of HFY warriors who had been watching in silence. "New test," he announced. "Zaira will fight 5 opponents at once." The warriors stiffened, exchanging glances. Even for a warrior of her skill, 5 was too many. Zaira grinned. Finally, a challenge she understood. Carter held up a finger. "But there's a rule. You can't kill them." Zaira's grin faded. She stared at him, confused. "What kind of challenge is this?" "The real kind," Carter said. "You win by defeating them without ending their lives. If you lose control, you fail." Zaira's stomach twisted. This was not a fight. It was a trap. She had never fought to spare an enemy before. What was the point? Still, she would not back down. She turned to the 5 warriors who stepped forward, each one skilled, each one eager to prove themselves against her. The moment Carter gave the signal, they attacked. Zaira reacted instantly, dodging the first strike and countering with a brutal punch to the ribs. The warrior grunted and collapsed, but Zaira stopped herself just in time. She had almost shattered his spine. She snarled in frustration. A second warrior lunged from behind. She twisted and grabbed his arm, ready to snap it like a twig. No killing. She hesitated, and in that moment of hesitation, a blade pressed against her throat. The third warrior had disarmed her without her even noticing. She froze. She had lost. Carter's voice broke the silence. "Lesson 2. If you only know how to kill, you will never truly win." Zaira felt the shame burn in her chest. She had been defeated not by strength, but by her own inability to control it. The warriors stepped back, waiting for Carter's next command. But he only looked at Zaira. "You're not ready yet," he said, "but you can be." Zaira clenched her jaw. She hated this. She hated how right he was. But deep inside, she knew she had to change. The enemy strikes. The sun had barely begun to set over the training grounds when the first alarm blared through the facility. A deep, echoing sound, loud enough to shake the walls. Zaira's head snapped up. That was not a drill. She had been in the middle of yet another training session with Carter, this time, controlling her attacks against 5 warriors. She had already failed twice, losing control and hitting too hard. But now, all thoughts of training disappeared. The HFY warriors around her instantly shifted into battle stances, their eyes sharp. The air crackled with tension. Carter, however, didn't move. He remained calm as ever, watching the horizon, studying, calculating. Then the first explosion hit. The force sent a shockwave through the ground, knocking some of the younger warriors off balance. Smoke and fire erupted in the distance. The training walls trembled. Zaira's blood burned with excitement. Finally, a real fight. But before she could charge forward, Carter grabbed her arm. "Wait." Zaira's eyes blazed with irritation. "Wait. Someone is attacking the facility." "Exactly," Carter said. his grip firm. "And if you rush in without thinking, you'll end up dead." Zaira hated how much sense he made. She took a deep breath and forced herself to think. Who would attack that HFY? They were feared across the galaxy. No one was foolish enough to challenge them directly. Then the enemy arrived. Out of the smoke, figures in dark armor emerged. Mercenaries. Their helmets were smooth and featureless, their weapons glowing with a sickly red light. Zaira's instincts screamed kill. Carter stepped in front of her. "Remember your lesson," he said quietly. "Strength isn't just destruction. It's control." Zaira's fists clenched. She knew what he was doing, testing her again. The enemy leader stepped forward, a towering figure in reinforced armor. He moved with confidence, his posture casual. He wasn't afraid of the HFY. That was interesting. He stopped a few feet away, tilting his head. "I expected more from the so-called strongest warriors in the galaxy. You don't look so impressive." The warriors around Zaira bristled with rage. They were moments away from attacking. Zaira took a slow step forward, her voice cold. "You made a mistake coming here." The leader laughed. "Did I?" Then, in a blur of motion, he moved. A knife shot toward Carter's chest. Fast, deadly. Zaira reacted without thinking. Her body moved on instinct, just as Carter had been drilling into her. Instead of using raw power, she used control, stepping in at the right angle, her massive hand catching the blade midair. The metal cut into her palm, but she barely felt it. The enemy leader's eyes flickered with something close to respect. "Interesting," he muttered. Carter, meanwhile, didn't even flinch. He had known she would stop it. Zaira growled, tossing the blade to the ground. "Who are you?" The leader grinned beneath his helmet. "Someone who knows your kind is all muscle and no mind." Zaira's anger flared, but this time, she did not act on it. Carter nodded slightly. "Good." The enemy leader took another step forward. "Tell me, warrior, do you really think that tiny human can make you stronger, or is he just making you weaker?" That hit harder than any weapon ever had. Zaira hesitated, just for a second, and the mercenaries attacked. Lasers and plasma fire erupted through the air. The warriors dove for cover, returning fire with deadly precision. But Zaira didn't move. For the first time, she was at war with herself. Everything she had been taught told her to unleash her strength, destroy everything in her path. But Carter had shown her another way, a better way. She had a choice: destroy without thinking, or fight with control. Carter, still standing beside her, simply said, "Your move." Zaira, a warrior reborn. The battlefield was chaos. Plasma fire streaked across the air, explosions rocked the ground, and smoke coiled into the darkening sky. The mercenaries had come prepared. Fast, tactical, ruthless. They weren't just common raiders. They were here for a reason. Zaira stood in the center of it all, heart pounding, fists clenched. Her massive frame was covered in dust and scorch marks from near misses. Around her, the warriors of the HFY fought ferociously, but they were losing. For the first time in her life, she didn't charge blindly into the fray. She saw the problem immediately. Her people were too predictable. They were fighting with brute strength, relying on overwhelming force. The mercenaries were faster, smarter. They moved with precision, striking and retreating before the HFY could react. If you only rely on power, a weaker enemy can outthink you. Carter's words echoed in her mind. And then she saw him. Carter was still standing in the open, completely calm in the storm of battle. He had no weapon, no armor, just his sharp eyes watching everything. He wasn't fighting. He was analyzing. For the first time, Zaira understood. This was not a battle of strength. It was a battle of strategy. A mercenary charged at her, firing plasma rounds at her chest. Old Zaira would have tried to dodge or power through. New Zaira saw the mistake. At the last second, she sidestepped, the energy bolt grazing past her ribs. Before the enemy could react, she grabbed his wrist and twisted, redirecting his own momentum, sending him crashing into the dirt. No wasted movement. No excess force. Carter had been teaching her this all along. Zyra turned to him, her eyes blazing with realization. Carter gave the smallest nod. Now you get it. She did. She wasn't just a brute force fighter anymore. She was something more. The shift in battle. Zyra turned to the battlefield and saw it clearly. The mercenaries were using formation tactics, separating the Tarkai into small groups and picking them off one by one. If she kept fighting the old way, her people would lose. She let out a sharp battle cry, a deep, powerful sound that cut through the noise. The Exarchai warriors turned to her. Then, for the first time in her life, she gave a command. Fall back into pairs, she roared. Do not attack alone. Move together. The warriors hesitated for only a moment, then obeyed. The tide shifted. By fighting smart, they forced the mercenaries into tighter positions. Their speed advantage was gone. The Exarchai struck with precision, covering each other's weaknesses. They weren't just brawlers anymore. They were warriors with purpose. The final duel. The enemy leader, the one who had mocked her before, watched all of this with sharp, calculating eyes. He stepped forward, rolling his shoulders. I underestimated you, Amazon. Zyra cracked her knuckles. Big mistake. He grinned, drawing a curved energy blade. Let's see if you've really learned control. This time, Zyra didn't lunge first. She waited. The leader charged at her, blade flashing in the firelight. Zyra saw the opening immediately. Instead of overpowering him, she redirected his attack, sidestepping at just the right moment. Her massive arm wrapped around his, twisting the blade from his grasp. In one swift motion, she brought him to his knees. The battlefield fell silent. For a long moment, the mercenary leader stared up at her, breathing hard. His blade lay in the dirt between them. She could end this now. One strike, one blow. But she didn't. Instead, she took a deep breath and stepped back. She spared him. Carter, watching from the sidelines, smiled slightly. Now you understand. The mercenaries, seeing their leader defeated but alive, slowly dropped their weapons. The fight was over. A warrior's choice. Zyra stood tall, feeling something strange in her chest, something lighter than the rage she had always carried. She had won. Not just the battle, but something greater. She turned to Carter. You were right. Carter simply nodded. I usually am. She smirked, shaking her head. Annoying human. But she owed him. Because today, Zyra the Untamed had become something greater. She had become a warrior with control. The ultimate test. The battle was over. The mercenaries had surrendered, their weapons discarded in the dirt. The Exarchai warriors stood victorious, their bodies covered in battle scars, but their spirits unbroken. And in the middle of it all stood Zyra the Untamed, no longer just a warrior of brute force, but something more. She had led them to victory. She had fought with strategy. She had spared an enemy instead of destroying him. And now, her real test was about to begin. The Galactic Council's summons. The victory had barely settled before a communication beacon flared to life. A cold, mechanical voice echoed through the training grounds. Zyra of the Tarkai, the Galactic Council has taken notice of your actions. You are hereby summoned to the High Tribunal. Prepare for transport. The warriors around her stiffened. The Galactic Council, the most powerful governing body in the known universe. They did not summon individuals lightly. Zyra clenched her fists. Was this a reward? A punishment? A trap? Carter, standing beside her, simply said, You knew this was coming. She glanced at him. What do they want from me? His expression remained unreadable. They want to know if you're still a weapon or if you've truly changed. Zyra took a deep breath. She had spent her entire life proving her strength in battle. But for the first time, this was a test she couldn't win with brute force. She turned to her warriors. "Hold the training grounds until I return." Then, without another word, she stepped into the council's transport chamber. Arrival at the High Tribunal. The council's citadel was massive, a floating fortress above the core planet. Tall pillars of light stretched into the sky, and the halls gleamed with polished steel and crystal-like architecture. Everything about it was meant to intimidate. But Xyra did not bow. She did not kneel. She had faced death in battle 1,000 times. She would not fear a room full of politicians. The chamber doors hissed open, revealing a grand circular hall. At the center sat the High Tribunal, an assembly of powerful leaders from across the galaxy. And in the middle of them all stood a familiar figure, General Vortin. Xyra's old commander, the one who had trained her to be a weapon, the one who had once told her, "Mercy is for the weak." Her jaw tightened. She should have known he'd be here. The challenge. Vortin stepped forward, his massive form towering even over her. His dark armor gleamed under the tribunal's lights. His sharp, reptilian eyes narrowed. "You've gone soft, Xyra," he said. "I've seen the reports. You fight with hesitation now. You let enemies live." The tribunal members murmured among themselves. Xyra stood tall. "I fight with purpose. Strength is nothing without control." Vortin laughed, a deep, rumbling sound. Words. Let's see if you believe them. A heavy silence filled the room. Then one of the tribunal members spoke. "We agree. Xyra's new path must be tested. We will settle this in the way of your people. A duel." Xyra's fists clenched. She knew what this meant. A battle to prove her worth. Against her former commander. Vortin smirked. "One final fight. Prove to me that this so-called control makes you stronger, or prove that you were always just a beast pretending to be a warrior." The duel begins. The arena was set within minutes. The council had no time for delays. Xyra and Vortin stood across from each other on the combat floor, a massive circular space with energy barriers surrounding them. No escape. No interruptions. Only one would stand at the end. Vortin drew his energy axe, its blade crackling with raw power. Xyra took a slow breath. She didn't reach for a weapon. Vortin sneered. "No blade, no armor. You insult me." Xyra's muscles tensed, but she did not move. "You always told me to rely on my strength. That's what made me unstoppable. But you were wrong." Vortin's eyes flashed with fury. "Then prove it." He attacked first. The axe swung in a deadly arc, powerful enough to cleave through solid metal. Xyra saw the movement, felt the familiar rush of battle instincts. Old Xyra would have met strength with strength. New Xyra saw the flaw. At the last second, she sidestepped, letting the axe swing past harmlessly. Vortin growled and turned, expecting her counterattack. But Xyra didn't strike. She waited. Vortin charged again, angry now. Sloppy. His attacks became wilder, more desperate. Xyra dodged each one, forcing him to expend energy, forcing him to grow tired. The tribunal watched in silence. Finally, Vortin overextended. His axe strike missed, and his balance wavered. Xyra moved in. With a single fluid motion, she gripped his wrist, twisted, and sent him crashing to the ground. She stood over him, her foot pressed against his chest. The fight was over. Vortin stared up at her, panting. His weapon lay just out of reach. She could end this now. One strike. One fatal blow. The tribunal waited, watching. Would she prove she was still a killer? But Xyra simply stepped back. Vortin's eyes widened in disbelief. "You would let me live?" Xyra exhaled slowly. "A warrior with control chooses their battles. I don't need to kill you to win." She turned to the tribunal. "I have passed your test." A long silence stretched across the room. Then the head of the tribunal stood. Indeed, you have. A new path. Zyra expected punishment. A warrior who refused to kill was a liability to the HFY. But instead, the tribunal bowed their heads in acknowledgement. You are no longer Zyra the Untamed, the head of the tribunal declared. You are Zyra the Chosen. Carter, watching from the shadows, allowed himself a small smile. She had done it. She had become something more. The true strength of an Amazon. The air inside the High Tribunal's grand hall felt different now. The silence was no longer heavy with judgment. It carried something else. Respect. Zyra stood in the center, her chest rising and falling with deep, controlled breaths. Across from her, Vorton remained on the ground, his massive body still recovering from their duel. His axe lay discarded, his pride wounded. He had trained her to be a weapon. And today, she had proven that she was something greater. The High Tribunal, a collection of some of the most powerful leaders in the galaxy, had just witnessed something they never expected. A HFY warrior, known for their brutality, had won a battle without killing. Zyra met their gazes, her posture unyielding. She was ready for whatever they decided. The head of the tribunal, an elder of the ancient Lissari race, finally spoke. His voice was calm, but his glowing blue eyes burned with intensity. Zyra the Untamed is no more, he declared. Today, she has proven that strength is more than destruction. That true warriors know when to fight, and when to stand down. The warriors watching from the upper levels shifted, their expressions unreadable. Some were impressed, others still feared change. Vorton, breathing heavily, slowly forced himself to his feet, his reptilian eyes locked onto Zyra, his jaw clenched. Then, to the shock of everyone present, he bowed his head. A low murmur rippled through the tribunal chambers. Zyra's chest tightened with emotion she couldn't name. This was the warrior who had trained her, who had once told her that mercy was for the weak. And yet here he was, acknowledging her victory. You have become stronger than I ever imagined, Vorton admitted, his voice gravelly. And I was a fool not to see it before. Zyra studied him for a long moment. Then she did something even she didn't expect. She offered him her hand. Vorton's eyes flickered with surprise. After a moment, he clasped her forearm in the warrior's grip of respect. It was done. Zyra had not only defeated her past, but changed the very foundation of what it meant to be strong. A new mission. But as the moment settled, Carter stepped forward. His blue eyes remained sharp, as if he were already looking toward the next battle. This was only the beginning, he said. Zyra turned to him. Explain. Carter exhaled, his voice lowering so only she could hear. The mercenaries weren't working alone. That attack on the training grounds, it wasn't just a raid. Someone sent them to test you. Zyra frowned. To test me. Carter nodded. And now that they've seen you, they'll be coming in full force. Zyra's jaw tightened. The victory she had just earned now felt like a single step on a much longer path. The High Tribunal will send me wherever I'm needed, she said. Carter crossed his arms. You don't need the tribunal to tell you where you're needed. You already know. Zyra turned, gazing over the assembled warriors. Her people. They had followed her into battle. They had listened when she commanded them to fight with strategy instead of rage. And now, they were waiting for her next move. For the first time, she understood what Carter had been trying to teach her from the beginning. Strength wasn't just about fighting. It wasn't even about winning. It was about choosing the right battles. It was about leading. She turned back to Carter, nodding once. Then we find whoever is behind this. And we end it. A small, knowing smile flickered across Carter's lips. Now you sound like a real warrior. The final decision. The High Tribunal watched the exchange, their gazes full of silent approval. The elder leader spoke once more. That XRK have always been a force of destruction. But today, we see a new path. He raised a hand. Zyra the Chosen, step forward. Zyra obeyed, standing before the tribunal without hesitation. You will be the first of your kind to serve not just the HFY, but the entire galaxy, the Elder continued. Your mission is no longer to conquer, it is to protect. A murmur spread through the chamber. The old ways were being rewritten. The warriors who had followed Xyra before would now follow her into something new. She had changed the future of her people, and for the first time in her life, she knew exactly who she was. The journey begins. That night, as Xyra stood at the edge of the Tribunal's grand citadel, she watched the stars stretch across the dark expanse. Behind her, the HFY warriors stood waiting. Carter stood beside her, arms crossed. So, where do we start? Xyra inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of the galaxy's future on her shoulders. She turned toward the warship waiting on the landing dock, wherever the real enemy is. Final line. Xyra the Chosen stepped forward, no longer just a warrior, but a legend in the making.